That's a
Hallelujah. Chag Sameach, everyone. Come on back, join us. We're going to get started with the teaching for today. We've been, of course, as I alluded to earlier, we've been studying the deliverances of Yahweh. And we saw that this has been a pattern throughout the history of Israel and all of his people. He delivers us today. He's delivered us through the Messiah.
Hallelujah.
And somehow that all got kind of, the work that he did in the past somehow got laid aside, at least in the minds of our Christian theologians and pastors and teachers. And the whole focus has been on Jesus or Yahushua the Messiah. And while I don't have an issue with that per se, I think that it is the centerpiece of all the deliverances that Father has accomplished for us. We still have to remember that the Father has delivered in the past and he is going to deliver in the future. And he's also in the business. He's doing the work. It's Yahushua said, "My Father is at work until this day, and I too am working." The Father and the Son are both working a work today, whether 7 days a week. The Sabbath doesn't stop the work of Elohim in his bringing about redemption for his people. He's always loving, he's always restoring, he's always healing. And so the Sabbath day is really for us. He laid down a pattern for us so that we would cease our labor on the seventh day. But his work, not the work of creation, which was completed, but his work of redemption is ongoing. His deliverances are ongoing for his people. And so hopefully this series of messages is bringing this to light, the fact that this is what the Father does for us, and that we can call upon him for deliverance today. Deliverance from disease and sickness and illness, deliverance from affliction, deliverance from the enemy that wants to bring us down, that wants to discourage us. We can get to all of those deliverances when we call out his name. And really that's another pattern that we saw is in the history of Israel. When the people were oppressed by their enemies, they would call out to the Father and he would hear them and send a deliverer. And so we can do the same today. I mean, we should be learning the lessons that were written down for us. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, that all of these things, these patterns are written down for us so that we can learn lessons from them, learn how the Father works, learn how the redemption takes place, and that we can avail ourselves or be beneficiaries of this gift that the Father wants to give to each one of us. So today we're going to break into, because it is the seventh day of the pilgrimage festival of unleavened bread, I want to go over the story which I believe is what happened on this day. We know that the first and the seventh days of unleavened bread, according to the instructions, are both appointed days. They're set apart Miqras, or they're set apart proclamations. And so we gather together on this day, ceasing from our own labor, because we're remembering something that the Father did. That's what the appointed days are all about, is remembering what the Father did for his people in the past, recognizing that they're all foreshadowing pictures of what the Messiah was to accomplish for his people, some of which have already been accomplished by the Messiah at his first coming, and others that are going to be accomplished at his second coming. So when I ask people, what happened on the seventh day of unleavened bread that calls for it to be an appointed day or a Miqra Kodesh, there had to have been something that the Father was reminding his people of, because we know that the Passover, the lamb that was slain so as to deliver them out of Egypt, setting them free from the bondage. But then something happened on the seventh day, and I never hear people talk about that. And there's good reason for that, is because it's not entirely clear from the scriptures what happened on the seventh day. And yet we know that it wasn't random, that the seventh day wasn't called an appointed day randomly. Something had to have happened. And so that's what I want to present today. And we go over the story. And this is the Deliverance, part 4, and it's through the Sea of Reeds. And that's what I'm suggesting that happened on the seventh day, is that the Father performed another great and mighty, miraculous miracle on the seventh day of unleavened bread, the deliverance of his people from Pharaoh, who decided to come after them again, but he delivered his people from Pharaoh. And again, I'll repeat that it's not written exactly and precisely in this way, but I am reaching out to have understanding about what the seventh day is. And I believe all the time frames line up. The fact that it's a great deliverance, it lines up with an appointed time. And so this is what I believe happened on the seventh day of unleavened bread. So I begin reading it, Shemot, or Exodus, and chapter 13. This is right after the instructions of Passover, how that they were to do it. And when their son asks them, what does this all mean? That they're to say, Yahweh rescued us from Egypt. And he says that this is like a sign on your hand and on your forehead, that the law of Yahweh is to be upon your heart. So when you do these things, when you make these remembrances year after year, you are indicating that you not only believe it, but you walk in it, and you trust the Father who provided such a redemption for his people to do the same for us today as well. So this is right after those instructions. It says, now when Pharaoh had let the people go, Elohim did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was near, for Elohim said the people might change their minds when they see war and return to Mitzrayim. So directly from the northern part of Goshen, and I'm going to show you a map here in a minute, that the people that are watching this online won't be able to see unless you download the PowerPoint slides from my website. And you can find those on BibleTruth.cc. Those PowerPoints will be there. But directly from the north of Goshen, there is a well-worn path. It was where the traders moved north and south, through the Middle East, from Turkey and all of those areas up in the north, all the way down into Egypt. And so there was a well-known and not paved, but packed down road that was in the northern portion between Egypt and the west coast of Israel, which was the land of the Philistines. And so the Father didn't want them to go that way, even though it was the shortest path to the land of promise that the Father had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because the Philistines were there, and the Philistines might make war against them. He didn't want his people to be discouraged, so he sent them on a different path, a path by the way of the wilderness. Hence, Elohim led the people around by the way of the wilderness to the Sea of Reeds, which is in Hebrew the Yam Suf. And the sons of Israel went up in martial array, my translation puts it, from the land of Mitzrayim. And the actual Hebrew word there means by 50s. The term martial array is literally by 50s, and what it means is that they were lined up in groups, like an army would go out to battle. They would be in position. They'd be marching together and moving together as a unit. And so he was going to lead them on the way of the wilderness. Let me do one more slide, and then we're going to look at the map. Moshe took the bones of Yosef with him, for he had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, Elohim will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones from here with you. And then they set out from Sukkot and camped in Etham on the edge of the wilderness. So as we get to the end of the story of Yosef, he does make this make his son swear, because Joseph wanted to be buried in the place of his forefathers. So when they left the land of Egypt to go back, because that was the promise of Elohim, Joseph was saying, make sure you don't forget to take my bones with you. I want to be in a grave in the father's land. So, he wanted to be a part of.
You would be buried in Mitzrayim.
He didn't want to be buried in Mitzrayim, but ultimately, in the land of promise. And so Moshe took the bones of Joseph with him. So here is a map, and I want to go through this a little bit. This is the traditional route of the Exodus. Okay, so here's the thing. There's a debate. There's been an ongoing debate for 100, 200 years between biblical scholars about what this route was that the Israelites took through the wilderness. And the traditional route is the route that is held even today by most of the scholarly world in biblical studies. Well, note at the top of the screen.
Can you take your mouse? You can take your mouse.
I don't know. Can I? Will it show? Does that show?
Yeah.
Okay, so here is the way to the land of the Philistines, the northern route. They would have left, northern Goshen. This is the area of Goshen. All of this in here. It's called Lower Egypt, but in terms of north, south, east, and west, it's upper. It's the northern part of Egypt, but it's Lower Egypt because the altitude was lower there near the sea. And so the quickest way would have been, here's Ramses in Lower Egypt, and to go up this road would have been really quick. Look at how quickly it was. I don't know, 40, 50 miles, I'm guessing. I don't have anything on the map to indicate distance on the map. But it would have been easy to go this way, but the father didn't want them to go this way and run into the Philistines in this area along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, because they likely would have wanted to fight the Israelites, and the father was trying to avoid that for them because he didn't want them to be discouraged. So that's the northern route, which we know they didn't take. Here's another route, and it kind of begins a little bit south of Ramses, and it goes east for a while, and then it kind of goes northeast, and it ends up going through, this road goes right through the center of what is now Israel, and what was then Israel as well, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea. And this also is not the route they took, even though this was another one of those routes that the traders used. The route that is the traditional route is along this path here, and it's shown in red on this map. It begins in Ramses because that's where they left from. They stopped off in Sukkot, which is also still in Egypt. It's in kind of the eastern part of Egypt. And so here's Sukkot. Sukkot, of course, meaning tabernacles or tents, because everyone was dwelling in tents there. It was like a tent city. So they call it Sukkot. They stopped first in Sukkot, and then it says they moved on. What does the text say? They moved on to camp on the edge of the wilderness in a place called Etham. And it doesn't show Etham on this map, but it's probably somewhere in here. The crossing of the Sea of Reeds. Yam Suf means Sea of Reeds. It doesn't mean Red Sea. There were a number of different waterways and seas in Egypt that had reeds in them, or weeds, if you will. And it could have been any number of these rivers or lakes that were along here. The traditional route has them crossing still in Egypt before they even got into the wilderness of Shur, which is in the Sinai Peninsula. So the Red Sea crossing in the traditional view would have been probably this lake right here, which is called Lake, what does that say? Lake, boy, I can't even read it. It's too tiny for me. What does it say? Can anybody read that right there?
Timsa.
Timsa, yeah, Lake Timsa, that's right. And Kathy and I watched a video last night, part one of that Patterns of Evidence.
Avia, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Avia.
You are.
And so Tim Mahoney was explaining all these different things and having interviews with all these different Hebrew and Egyptian scholars, Egyptologists, and so forth. And he was going over all of these different points of view. So they would say that the Sea of Reeds that they crossed, that the Father parted, was somewhere up here along the eastern border of Egypt. And from there they went south all the way along the Gulf of Sinai. Oops.
The Aqaba. Suez.
The Gulf of Suez, thank you. Yeah, this is the Gulf of Suez on the map. The Suez Canal that we've heard a lot of in the recent past couple weeks with that ship that got stuck in the Gulf of Suez is actually a man-made canal that runs. It connects these waterways all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea. So it would run somewhere like along here, the modern-day Suez Canal. Anyway, so the traditional view has them going down south into the wilderness of Sin, where Mount Sinai supposedly was located. And St. Catherine's is supposed to be a monastery that marks the spot, as it were. And so this is the traditional view, a view held by many scholars even today. Now, what was also interesting in that video I saw last night was that for the past almost 200 years, all the maps, until more recently, the maps that were made of the Middle East in this Sinai area didn't have the Gulf of Aqaba on them. It was like non-existent in their maps. And so the scholars going by those maps, these maps were made by people that had walked the area. So the scholars were saying, well, there is no other. The Gulf of Aqaba, they didn't even know existed, or they assumed it didn't exist. So they had to devise their scenario of the path of the Israelites to go along the Gulf of, what did I say that was? Suez, and down into the lower Sinai Peninsula, where they thought Mount Sinai was. So here is a map that shows what current scholars who rely on the Hebrew text believe the actual path of the Israelites was. And again, it begins in Goshen, and it goes southeast to Sukkot, which was their first layover, the first place they stopped off and camped. Then it goes eastward from there. There is another route through the Sinai Peninsula, and it's along all of these waterways. And it would make sense that this is how, for the first 7 days, they got water. They had the unleavened bread that they took with them, but they needed water. So this was where they would have been getting their water, along all these waterways, until they got to all the way down here into the place called Etham, where they turned. And we're going to read that in, I think, the next slide or two, where Yahweh commanded them to turn toward Pi-Hahirot. So they turned at Etham, and then they went south, basically to the middle of Yam Suf, where the place called Nueva is located. It's right along the shore of the Sea of Reeds, and this is where Pi-Hahirot. Now, in Hebrew, Pi-Hahirot means the mouth or the opening of the two mountains, or of the mountains, literally, of the mountains. And so there was a mountain path that they went through to get to the shore of the sea, it was a very narrow valley that went through some very high mountains. And when you come out to the opening of those two mountains, it opens up onto the seashore at Yam Suf, which is called Nueva. And so this is what I subscribe to this view, that this is the actual path they take. The only problem was that it's quite a bit more distance for the Israelites to travel in 6 days. But again, the video showed interviewed people. Tim Mahoney interviewed people who were describing how long it would take for people, 2 million people, to walk that kind of a distance. And he said it could be accomplished between 5 and 10 days. And even there was a sheep expert that said certain types of sheep that were in this area of the world at the time could go as fast as a human, and they didn't need much food or water. And they could travel this distance all the way to the Yam Suf in 6 days, along with the people. The children would be on wagons or donkeys or horses or whatever, and so they could conceivably make this trip. And that's why I believe that this is the location on the Yam Suf where the parting of the Red Sea occurred. So are y'all with me now?
What is that scale at the top? Is that a 50 mile? Is that 50 miles?
Yeah.
Oh, it is, yeah. There's 50. So the distance would have been about 200 miles from Goshen all the way down to the Yam Suf. Could they cover the 200 miles, roughly 200 miles, in 6 days? And the answer is, yeah, they could do that. It was possible. Because we're going to read next in this next slide why they could accomplish that. So Shemot, Exodus 13, 21 to 22, it says, Yahweh is going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them on the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. So they were traveling not all the way through the week, but probably several of the days they were traveling by day and by night. They were robust. They had been slaves. They were a strong people.
And they were running.
And so they were able to do this. It was not, like I think some of us, like me especially, I couldn't do this. I couldn't make this trip.
Put you on a donkey, buddy.
I don't have the strength. I'd be on the donkey with the children. Okay, so, but they were a robust people. They were a strong people, and they would be able to make this 200-mile trip in 6 days, traveling by day and by night. And the Father provided that they could do that. And so He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. And so this is how they are able to accomplish it. Because everything was set up. They were, again, they had the bread with them, they had water along the way, all those waterways and lakes and streams and wadis, which are valleys, they're like riverbeds. And so there would be water for them along the way to the Sea of Reeds. In chapter 14 now we turn to, verses 1 through 3, it says, Now Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, Tell the sons of Israel to turn and camp before Pi-hahirot. And this is where they turned at Etham. They were heading basically eastward, and then at Etham they turned and they headed southward. The word turn is sometimes translated as turn back, but it doesn't mean turn back. It just means any kind of turn. They could have turned north, south, east, or west. It was just they changed directions is what that Hebrew word means. So they turned so that they could go southward to Pi-hahirot, between Migdol and the sea. And so that's where they came out. When they came out from between those mountains at the opening or the mouth of the two mountains, it opened up into a beach area. And that's where 2 million Israelites stayed, at least for a very short period of time. Because they were trapped, as another Hebrew teacher explains succinctly, that there was no way of escape. The only way back was to go back through that mountain pass, because the mountains came up to the sea, and were very high mountains. They couldn't be scaled. They couldn't get around the mountains, between the sea and the mountain. There was no space between the sea and the mountains. So they were literally trapped. There was nowhere to go but back, the way that they came. But Pharaoh and his army were coming after them, and so they were literally trapped and had nowhere to go. So the Father said, "You shall camp in front of Baal Zephon, opposite it by the sea." Baal Zephon is the town or city across the Yom Suf, on the other side of the water, and they could see that. I mean, it was a number of miles. Does anybody remember? It was like probably 20 miles, 20, 30 miles across the sea to the other side to Baal Zephon. So they could see. I mean, when you look across a river, you can see 30, 40, 50 miles. If you have a lake there, you can see that distance. So they could see Baal Zephon from where they were on this side of the sea. It says, "For Pharaoh will say of the sons of Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land, the wilderness has shut them in." So Pharaoh thought, that he had trapped them in, that they had no way of escape, and so Pharaoh figured they were just going to destroy the Israelites, or maybe capture them and drag them back to Egypt to be slaves again, the ones that didn't resist so much. Because we know that there were some that wanted to go back to Egypt. They didn't so much like the wilderness. And so there were people that probably would have willingly gone back. So verse 4, Exodus 14:4 says, "Thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them." I want to do a quick look at this word harden, because we encountered this over and over again in the 10 plagues, how Moshe went to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh hardened his heart. I want to look at this word harden. It's the Hebrew word hazak, and it's probably a word that you're familiar with. Hazak. Does that ring a bell for you? Hazak means to be or grow firm, strong, or to strengthen. To become strong or to strengthen. And most famously, we see this word in Joshua chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, where it says, "Be strong and courageous, for you shall give this people possession of the land, which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong." And that's the word, hazak. Be strong and very courageous. So when Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart, what it means is he strengthened him. He emboldened him to be strong and to assert his own authority, so that he wouldn't be submitting to the Father's will, because the Father wanted to show his miraculous signs.
Hallelujah.
And so Pharaoh was emboldened and strengthened to say, "No, I'm not going to let the Israelites go out into the wilderness." So when we think of a hardening of heart, that often takes the form not just in, "Oh, I don't want to submit to the Father," but in a certain boldness and in a certain assertion of one's own will.
Stubborn.
And a stubbornness, like I'm going to do it my way. And this is what the word hazak means. And this is how Pharaoh's heart was hardened, is that he refused to see it any other way. And I think the reason I'm pointing this out is that it's applicable in our world, because we see people who are emboldened even after they hear the truth. They're emboldened to just go on their own way and say, "I prefer this way. I'm not gonna do, what you're suggesting is the interpretation of Scripture. I'm not gonna follow that path, but I'm gonna go at my own way. I'm gonna follow what I've been taught, following the traditions and the doctrines and the denomination that I've been brought up in." And that's a hardening of the heart. That's a strengthening of one's resolve to do what they have already decided and determined to do. And that's what we're talking about here. So that's how we can recognize a hardening of heart, is when somebody is persistent in saying, "I'm doing it this way, because this is what everybody I know the way that they do it.
Is it the same as stiff-necked?
It is stiff-necked, yeah. It's an unwillingness to bend. Is I think what stiff-necked is really all about. It's putting your head up high and being proud about what you have decided to do, and taking no other course but this is the way I'm going to do it. That's being stiff-necked or hardening one's heart. So just so that we can recognize it when we see it. So he said, I will harden Pharaoh's heart and he will chase after them. And I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army. And the Mitzrayim, or the Mitzrites, the Egyptians, will know that I am Yahweh. So where he says, I will be honored, that's the same word also, where it says, honor your father and your mother. It means to have respect for. It means to consider them to be weighty or of great importance. It's prioritizing, our parents in terms of exalting them because of the position and the authority that they hold over us as our parents. And so the same word is used here. Anyway, honor your father and your mother. Yahweh would be honored through Pharaoh because he was going to gain respect from the people on account of his ability to perform the miraculous, which he's about to do. And it says they did so. They did so. And so when the king of Mitzrayim was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart toward the people. And they said, what is this that we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So you can imagine after they had been grieving for a couple of days over their firstborn, that all of a sudden Pharaoh's like, what did I do? I let all my free labor go. Let's go chase him down and bring him back. So he had a change of heart. He wanted to bring him back. Again, this hardening of heart. And so he made his chariot ready and took his people with him. And he took 600 select chariots and all the other chariots of Mitzrayim with officers over all of them. Yahweh hardened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Mitzrayim, and he chased after the sons of Israel as the sons of Israel were going out boldly. So Pharaoh had a change of heart. He's chasing down the Israelites. Even though the sons of Israel it says they went out boldly, they went out with great confidence that the Father, having delivered them, since Pharaoh had ruled that they could leave now and go out into the wilderness to serve their Elohim. So they did so boldly, and that boldness takes a manifestation in the fact that they asked all of their neighbors for stuff, right? Clothing and gold and silver articles and anything of value that they could take with them. So they plundered the Egyptians in that way and marched out boldly. And then the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, chased after them with all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army, and they overtook them by camping by the sea. They overtook them, the Israelites, camping by the sea, beside Pi-Hahirot in front of Baal Zephon. So there they are in what is modernly called Nueva, this great big, huge beachhead, and the 2 million Israelites were there. And so Pharaoh and his armies came through and trapped them. But now watch what happens. Pharaoh drew near, and the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Mitzrayim were marching after them, and they became very afraid, very frightened. So the sons of Israel cried out to Yahweh. And there's the key that I keep emphasizing. They cried out. They recognized that they needed help, that they were trapped, that they were about to be victims, and the only way out was to cry out to somebody greater than they in order to help them. So they cried out to Yahweh. And what happens when we cry out to Yahweh?
He helps.
He answers our prayers. Hallelujah. Yes, he does. He delivers and he helps and he rescues and he causes a way of escape. And that's what he's going to do here. He's going to open up a way of escape, like we've talked about several times in the past. Verses 11 through 12, it says, Then they said to Moshe, Is it because there were no graves in Mitzrayim that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us up out of Mitzrayim? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Mitzrayim, saying, leave us alone that we may serve the Mitzrayim? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And of course, this was not all of the Israelites. There were those who were calling out and asking for help. But there were those among the Israelites who doubted all along. They weren't for this plan
They
of going out
wanted
into
to
the wilderness.
They want the shot.
They wanted, okay, I'm not going to go into that. But yeah, they didn't want to leave Egypt because they thought they still had it pretty good. They had their leeks and onions, and even though the labor was hard, they at least had a home of their own, and they wanted to go back to that. So many of the sons of Israel doubted the Father's plan at this point and said, let's just go back to Egypt. But Moshe said to his people, do not fear. Stand by and see the deliverance of Yahweh, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. Yahweh will fight for you while you keep silent. And then Yahweh said to Moshe, why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to move on. And so here's the dilemma. It's like, okay, but move on to where, right? Move on to where? Father had promised that all they had to do was just obey. They didn't even have to fight. All they had to do was be silent and obey, and that they would be delivered. And so where are they going to move on to? He said to them then, raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the waters so that the sons of Israel can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Mitzrites again so that they will go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Mitzrites will know that I am Yahweh when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So here it is that he was told to stretch out his hand, raise your staff and stretch out your hand. It's the same staff that he used to perform signs in Egypt. The same staff that he threw to the ground before Pharaoh, and it became a snake, and they picked it up by its tail, and it became a rod again. So this staff that Moshe had was an instrument that he could use to perform the miraculous. He touched the water and it turned to blood, and he stretched his hand and his staff up to heaven, and the hail came down. And so he was using the staff in all of these various miracles that were performed. And here again, all he had to do was stretch out his staff over the waters of the Yam Suf, and the Father was going to part the water. And so here's the account. And then the angel of Elohim, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Mitzrayim and Yisrael. And throughout the night the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. We just talked about this in the Yosef story, didn't we? That when the brothers came back to Egypt and presented themselves to Pharaoh, they were to insist that they were keepers of livestock. They were shepherds. And that way, the Father could keep them separated from the Egyptians and the Egyptian culture. They would still turn out to be slaves to Pharaoh, but they wouldn't be integrating with the Egyptians. They could remain with their own unique identity as a family, and thus when they were ready to leave Egypt, they were still known by their tribes and by their families. So they could easily identify one another and remain as a single nation. So here it is that the Father, by his own presence, by the pillar of cloud and the fire, he stood between the army of Pharaoh and the people of Israel, causing another separation, a distinction so that Israel wouldn't be attacked by Pharaoh's army. And then Moshe stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night, Yahweh drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. And so I wanted to point this out, that that this crossing of the sea occurred at night. The night being the beginning part of day 7. Okay, because I think we pretty much can agree, maybe not entirely, but that a day consists of a period of darkness and then a period of light. And so this 7th day of unleavened bread was a period of darkness, and it was during this period of darkness on day 7 that the Father drove the sea back and the waters were divided, and the sons of Israel went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. And so they passed through the sea at night. There was a significant point there, and I forget what it was, but maybe I'll come back to it. But it was that night that this occurred. The Mitzrites pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. This is still at night. And then it says, during the last watch of the night, Yahweh looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Mitzrite army and threw it into confusion. He made the wheels of their chariots come off so that they had difficulty driving. Maybe it started to get muddy or something. I mean, maybe the water began to creep back in onto that dry ground and soften it and cause them to get stuck in the mud. And the Mitzrites said, let's get away from the sons of Israel. Yahweh is fighting for them against Mitzrayim. So they even recognize that this is the God of Israel again, doing his thing. He's bringing about another catastrophe for us. They had been through so many catastrophes with the loss of their livestock and boils on everybody in Egypt and the hail. Yeah. Well, I mean,
if I was in their shoes, I would have let them go. Just go on.
but I mean, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He was determined to bring them back. So he slipped through down into the sea, following them until he realized that, oops, I made a mistake. So all of the Mitzrites who were there realized that Yahweh was again fighting for the Israelites. And then Yahweh said to Moshe, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Mitzrites and their chariots and horsemen. And so Moshe stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Mitzrites were fleeing toward it, and Yahweh swept them into the sea. The waters flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the sons of Israel into the sea. Not one of them survived. And so this is the great deliverance, another great deliverance of the Father. And it says the sons of Israel went through the sea on dry ground. This is kind of a summary statement. Sons of Israel went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. And that day Yahweh saved Israel from the hands of the Mitzrites. And Israel saw the Mitzrites lying dead on the shore. And when the sons of Israel saw the great power Yahweh displayed against the Mitzrites, the people feared Yahweh and put their trust in him and in Moshe, his servant. Awesome Wonders was the title of this slide. Produces fear of Yahweh. And I think if we don't have the fear of Yahweh, we need to go back and read the accounts and be reminded of the incredible, miraculous things that he has done for his people. So that, the army of Pharaoh was destroyed in the waters. And this should produce fear for anybody who takes to heart the story, with consideration of who this Yahweh, the God of Israel, is. That he's able to perform miraculous deliverances, but he's also able to perform miraculous judgment and destruction of a wicked people. And so the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom. If we're wise people, we're going to have that same fear of Yahweh. And that doesn't mean just reverence and respect, although it includes that. It means literally fearing, being afraid of what he's capable of doing. When we have that in mind, as long as we're on the right side of things, if we're in relationship with him, we don't have to fear judgment, but we still have to fear Yahweh for what he could do if we're to go our own way. Because he's consistent in his judgment. He's righteous in his judgment. And he will, as he has promised, destroy the wicked. But he will exalt and reward those who are faithful to him. So again, just to summarize, this is the only event in this whole series of events that could correspond to why the seventh day of unleavened bread would be called an appointed time. It was the appointed time, like all the appointed times, it was a time of deliverance of the Father for his people. And so for each one of the appointed times, we see deliverances happening. And we're going to see more deliverances in the future as Messiah returns. We're going to see the additional deliverances of his people. We read about in the prophet Zechariah and in other places, what's going to go down in that day. That he's going to save his people, but he's going to destroy the wicked. So the next events that we read in this account in the book of Exodus are those of water to drink and the manna that comes down. This is after they've crossed the Red Sea that these things come. So when they're on the other side of the Sea of Reeds, that really is a dry and deserted wilderness. They don't have a whole lot of water sources or food sources on the other side. And that's why the Father then began to provide manna and water from the rock and those various other miracles that were performed when Moshe used his rod and did what the Father told him to do. The whole community of the sons of Israel set out from Elim, going back to chapter 16, verse 1, and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. Actually, I'm going forward, on the 15th day of the second month after they'd come out of Mitzrayim. So they'd crossed the Red Sea, and they came to the other side, and this is where the next events occur that we're going to talk about later on. So the seventh day of unleavened bread is an appointment. It's where Yahweh met his people to deliver them, and it was a salvation event. The sons of Israel were delivered from death. So this was the summary statement that I thought I was on this slide. It says, back in 14 verse 13, it says that Moshe answered the people, "Do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance Yahweh will bring you today." And then it says in verse 30, that day Yahweh delivered Israel, or saved Israel, from the hands of the Mitzrites. Hallelujah. So the idea of crossing over, I'm just going to take 1 second to talk about this, and then we're going to look at the praise song, Moshe's song of praise, which follows in chapter 15 of Exodus. But I just wanted to point this out, that Hebrew, as we all probably know, means crossed over. And it refers back to our ancestors who crossed over the river Babylon to come into the region of the Middle East, which was Canaan. They had to cross over, and therefore they were transformed. What I believe that crossing over means is a transformation. It's a commitment that one makes. When you cross over into something else, you're making a commitment or a change in your life to walk in a different way, or to head down a different path, or to have a different mindset. And so the sons of Israel transitioned on this day. When they crossed the Sea of Reeds, they were transitioning into a new way of life that they had not known or understood when they were in Egypt. Because now they were fully committed. They couldn't go back. They probably could have. They would have had to have gone north up to the tip of the Sea of Reeds and then gone, a couple hundred miles west back into Egypt if they were willing to do that. But this idea of crossing over means to be fully committed. And I think when we get to Shavuot, I want to talk about baptism, because this, I believe, is what baptism is all about. It's about making a commitment to a certain path in your life, a transitioning of your life from one way of life to another way of life. That's what baptism is a symbol of. And the Red Sea crossing, Paul says, was kind of a type of baptism, he says in 1 Corinthians 10. So just pointing that out, and we'll talk more about baptism at a later date, probably about 6 weeks from now. We're going to talk about that. So let's move on, and I'm going to finish up with Exodus 15, and I want to read through Moshe's song of praise. Then Moshe and the sons of Israel sang this song to Yahweh and said, I will sing to Yahweh, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. My strength and my song is Yah. He has become my salvation. He is my Elohim, and I will praise him, my father's Elohim, and I will exalt him. And we see in the Psalms a number of Psalms that read kind of like this, and with the same general format of praising the Father for his mighty works that have been done on our behalf, committing ourselves to him. You know, he says he's my strength and my song and my deliverer, and just making this decision in life to follow the Father because he has delivered us and saved us from our enemies. And then when we come to verses 3 through 6, it says Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. Hallelujah. Pharaoh's chariots and his armies he has cast into the sea, and the choicest of his officers are drowned in the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds. The deeps cover them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, Yahweh, is majestic in power. Your right hand, Yahweh, shatters the enemies. In the greatness of your excellence, you overthrew those who rise up against you. You send forth your burning anger. It consumes them as chaff. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters were piled up. The flowing waters stood up like a heap. The deeps were congealed in the heart of the sea. I wonder if anybody here that has musical ability, the ability to compose rhythms and music, could put these words, because this was sang as a song back in the day. It would be fun to be able to sing this song, you know, with a melody and with a harmony and or whatever it takes, you know, and just to sing this song of Moshe. It's a song of joy. It's a song of worship and praise to the Father. He goes on to say in verses 9 and 10, the enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall be gratified against them. I will draw out my sword, my hand will destroy them. But you blew with your wind, the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. They had no chance. Now here's our verse. Here's our song. Who is like you among the gods, Yahweh? Who is like you? Majestic in holiness, awesome in praises, working wonders. And so that's the Miqra song that we sing. We sing it in Hebrew and in English. And it's taken from this account of Elohim showing himself to be strong and great in the midst of his people. Who is like you among the gods, Yahweh? Who is like you? Majestic in holiness, awesome in praises, working wonders. Hallelujah. You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In your act of love, you have led the people whom you have redeemed. In your strength, you have guided them to your holy habitation. The peoples have heard, they tremble. Anguish has gripped the inhabitants of Philistia. Then the chiefs of Edom were dismayed. The leaders of Moab, trembling, grips them. And all the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them. By the greatness of your arm, they are motionless as stone. Until your people pass over, Yahweh. Until the people pass over whom you have purchased. You will bring them and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, the place, Yahweh, which you have made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. So it's recorded elsewhere that all the nations around heard of these great and miraculous things that the Father had done, and they were trembling in their boots. Their knees were shaking and tapping each other. They were very much afraid of the Israelites, and they didn't want anything to do with them. For the most part, there were a couple of nations that stood up against them, but Israel defeated Og, the king of Bashan, and Sihon. He was the king of some other king. It wasn't the Amalekites. It was somebody else.
They were giants, weren't they?
They were. But all the nations heard of the exploits of the Father and the great miraculous signs, and so they were afraid of Israel. Last slide. Yahweh shall reign forever and ever, for the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and his horsemen went into the sea, and Yahweh brought back the waters of the sea on them. But the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea. And so it's like 3 times he keeps repeating this refrain that Pharaoh's armies dropped off into the sea, were drowned in the sea, but the Father brought his people back and rescued them from the hands of Pharaoh. So this is another of the great deliverances, and I hope that the examples that we see here, and really we're going to, again, like I said, we're going to talk about baptism later on at Shavuot, because this was a baptism. This was a transitioning point for the sons of Israel. Not all of them caught on, and there was still rebellion in the desert. But for those who were committed, this was a point of no return, I guess you could say, for them. And so they were on their way to the promised land. And that's what I have for you today. Your comments about what we read, maybe testimonies. What do you have to share today?